Roald Dahl's The Twits, read by the Pinewood staff team. Hairy faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it's impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you or I wash the hair on our heads. So what I want to know is this. How often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us, on a Sunday night? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to a barber to have their faces cut and trimmed, or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know, but next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out on the street, maybe you'll look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things.
Mr. Twit was one of those very hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered with thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that this hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand. But in truth, he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now, at the age of 60, he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly, nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years.
As you know, an ordinary unhairy face like yours simply gets a bit smudgy if it's not washed often enough. And there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a very different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in amongst the hairs and stays there. You can wipe your smooth faces with a flannel and quickly look more or less right again. But the hairy man can't do that. You can also, if you are careful, eat your meals without spreading food all over your faces. But not so the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream or chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunch and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you, because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand, or sometimes his sleeve, while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd really want to, you would see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled egg stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers. and minced chicken livers and all the other disgusting things Mr. Twit liked to eat. If you looked closer still, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen. If you peer deep into the moustachious bristles sticking out over his top lips, you will probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand. Things that have been there for months and months, like a piece of maggoty green cheese, or a mouldy old cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tin sardine. Because of all this, Mr. Twit never really went hungry. By sticking out his tongue, and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he could always find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I'm trying to tell you is Mr. Twit was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely hurried old man, as you will find out in a moment. Chapter 4. Mrs. Twit. Mrs. Twit was no better than a husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. That was a pity, because it would have, at some rate, hidden some of her fearful ugliness. If you were to look at her, you would never have seen a woman as ugly as that. But the funny thing is that Mrs. Twit was never always ugly. She hadn't been born ugly. She had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown on her year on year as she got older. But how did that happen? I'll tell you how. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on their face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts can never be ugly. You can have a wonky nose, a crooked mouth, a double chin and sticking out teeth. But if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like a sunbeam, and you will always look lovely. Nothing shone out of Mrs. Twit's face. In her right hand, she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot, and that walking was painful. But the real reason she carried the stick was so that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and little children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs. Twit had a glass eye that always was looking the other way. End of chapter 4.
The glass eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again any time you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out a glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and then wiped his sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back so he couldn't see that she had taken out a glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up really nasty tricks he could play on his wife that day. "You'd better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat."
"Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat. He caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eyes staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you better be careful." The frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She laid there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed, "Ah!" "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said.
"Help!"
screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about.
"There's something in my bed."
"I bet it's a giant skillywiggler. I saw it on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said.
"That what?"
screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers."
"Help! Help!"
screamed Mrs. Twit.
"Save me! It's all over my feet."
"It'll bite your toes," Mr. Twit said. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of the bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a great time. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again.
"Ah, it's a jolly."
"It's a jolly. By jolly, it's a giant skillywiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of the bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow.
The wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," cried Mr. Twit, poking around it with his fork. "It's a new kind," Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. "It's called squidgy spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, taking his mouthful. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. "I find it a bit rather bitter," Mr. Twit said. "It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "You want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of the tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "And why has it a distinct bitter nasty taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it's worms," cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with a horrible laughter. "Ha ha ha!" The funny walking stick. To pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, onto the bottom of the stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't even notice. The following night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly so that the extra bits looked like part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it's almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly, you can't even notice it from week to week. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why is it so?" Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong with it. I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong with it, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes, it jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks, that's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down.
As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair, and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you, sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mr. Twit became so frightened, Mrs. Twit became so frightened, she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I say not more than 10 or 11 days." "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mrs. Twit. "Mr. Twit, I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit.